Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar brought to you by NQA. I say good afternoon, it is where I am in the UK. If you're in any other part of the world listening in, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. So thank you for joining us. Before we start, we'll just double check that you're all expecting the webinar that you've turned up for. You should be able to see the screen that says it's ISO 50001, that's the Energy Management Standard, ISO 50001 2018, and we're going to be having a look at the transition to the new standard. So transition from the 2011 standard to the 2018 standard. So a couple of slides just about NQA, not going to dwell on those. If you've been to an NQA webinar before, you'll have seen those, I'm sure. We were asked to put in, we've all now had these little slides produced, so you can see what I look like, and a little bit about me as well. I'm NQA's Principal Assessor for Energy and Environment. I've been at NQA now for 13.5 years, and prior to that I worked in the UK for an environmental charity called Groundwork. Working again as a consultant in that instance, implementing predominantly ISO 14001 standards with a number of clients. So the webinar itself, couple of housekeeping things before we get too far down the road. One, there's no need to frantically scribble down everything I'm saying. The webinars, all the webinars that we do NQA wise are being recorded. They will all appear on our YouTube channel. Every attendee will get a follow-up email which will have a copy of the slides, a PDF copy of the slides, so you'll be able to see the slides at your own leisure. And if you want to go back and listen again, then not only will this webinar, but previous webinars that I've done, and also other webinars that my colleagues have done on health and safety and quality and various other areas, the new COVID-19 information that we're providing, all of those webinars are available on our YouTube channel. And again, you'll be sent details on how to access that. So what we're going to look at today for about an hour. If you've sat through any of my webinars before, you'll realise that they can run on a little bit sometimes. Now, I make no apologies for that. We're going to be looking at the new standard. We're going to have a quick look at some of the new concepts in these new standards. The main focus of the webinar will be to look through the clauses and look at what they mean, and look at some of the new areas that may be in there, and particularly to give you an idea of what we as a certification body will be looking for when we come in and carry out assessments. Transition process, a little bit about that, and then a slide on some tips and question and answers. Now, on that subject of question and answers, we can do this in two ways, and I don't mind either way. On the right-hand side of your screen, you should see a number of boxes, one of which should say questions on it. If you have any questions, type them into there as we go along. If I think it's pertinent to answer them at the time, then I will do. If it pertains to something we were covering, say 5 or 10 minutes previously, and I'm not going to go back, we'll save those to the end. Normally what we tend to find is that we end up with the presentation finishing at about after about 50-55 minutes. If people need to leave at the end, fine, but typically we've gone over by about 10 or 15 minutes, usually because we're still getting into answering some questions. So let's move on. So the sort of things we're hoping to, well, I'm hoping you'll leave here with this afternoon, is an understanding of the key concepts of ISO 50001 itself. So why is it there as a standard, what it's setting out to achieve. Some of the new terminology and important definitions introduced in that standard, the 2018 standard. The main element, as I say, we'll be looking at the specific clauses and the requirements and the evidence that organisations implementing the standard or transitioning to the standard will be expected to provide. A little bit about the transition timelines and notable dates, and if you haven't already noticed, there has been a change to one of the dates. We'll cover that in a couple of slides' time, and some thoughts and some tips from me on maybe how to prepare for the changes and the implications of those changes for maintaining certification. All of the standards, all of these new standards, be it the new, it's not that new now, but the 2015 versions of 9001, 14001, 45001, which is obviously the new health and safety standard, and so on, they all have what are known as intended outcomes. So in other words, by implementing and maintaining the system or a system to that standard, you will achieve something. There will be an intended outcome. And the intended outcome in all cases is continual improvement in whatever the standard is setting out to achieve. So if, for instance, it's continual improvement in energy, in this case, it might be in health and safety performance, it might be in environmental performance. The fulfillment of compliance obligations is another intended outcome, and also the achievement of whatever objectives you've set or a company has set relevant to the particular standard. Introduced also in all of these standards is a section, not necessarily a section, but it permeates through the whole standard, covering the management of change and looking at how we use the standards to manage change. So one of the things I've been working on over the past 2 or 3 weeks, along with some of my colleagues, are guidance notes, and there's information on the NQA webinar about coronavirus, about COVID-19, and how you can use your existing management standards, management systems, to manage the changes that virus, the social distancing, the different ways of working, to manage the changes that will require. And by having the standards in place, it gives us a good way of using those standards themselves to manage any changes that we may need. So management of change is one of the key changes, if you like, in the new standards. They focus a lot more on the planning process, which is part of that management of change. There's new sections in the standard on the management of risks and opportunities. Usually risk is seen as something negative and opportunities are seen as something positive, although the standard themselves define risk as either opportunities, as either positives or negatives. I tend to use the language that we tend to understand better, and I tend to talk about risks and opportunities. And then also the fact that all these standards line up now, they are there to better integrate and to integrate with each other and also with the wider business processes. Not going to spend too much time on this standard. It just shows a little bit about where standards have come from, how standards have developed, and maybe to taking us up to the original standard, ISO 50001:2011, which started out as a British standard. A couple of years before that, in 2009, the world's first energy management standard was published as a British standard 16001, but it didn't take too long before it was transferred into the standard that some of us may still have at the moment, ISO 50001:2011. Now, this is where there's a slight change. So this slide is a timeline showing where 50001 came from. I could have taken it further over to the left and shown the beginnings of it with 16001, but we'll start with 2011 when the original standard was issued. The draft new standard came out what seems a long time ago now, in 2017. And the new standard itself, the 2018 version, was published on the 21st of August 2018. Now, common with all of these new standards, there was initially a 3-year transition period, which would have taken us up to the 21st of August 2021 next year. Now, you've probably seen, or hopefully you've seen, but if you haven't, take note. The transition period, because of the coronavirus situation that we find ourselves in globally, the transition periods, in common with the other standards, the same with ISO 45001, the transition periods have been extended, and the new expiry date of the standard is the 31st of January 2022. So we're still probably, 20 months away from the end of the old standard. And if anybody hasn't transitioned by that date, end of January 2022, then your certificates will expire. To be fair, most of the visits that we're doing now, most of the surveillance and recertification visits are against the new standard. Certainly the recertification visits are. We still have a number of surveillance visits ongoing that are to the old standard, usually because that's the second surveillance visit, and the recert will be done next year to the new standard. So that's where we're at. Obviously that transition period has been extended, and obviously we're providing training and support, of which this is a part, right the way through to the end of January in 2022, which seems a long way away, but it will be with us pretty quickly, I'm sure. So why do we need to change? Why did we need to change? What was wrong with all the old standards? We were all happy with them, I think. We all knew what we were doing. Why did we need to change? Well, standards change anyway. There is an ongoing cycle of reviewing and renewing standards, and mainly that's to ensure that they maintain relevance to industry, commerce, and the various organisations that are certified to them. This standard, as I say, was produced in 2018. It's likely to be somewhere between 7 and 10 years before the next update will come along. If I'm honest, I probably won't be working at NQA, and then I'm hopefully retired by 2028. But the standards are there to provide a consistent foundation for the next 10 years. Obviously, they change to reflect the increasingly complex environments in which organisations operate. If you think maybe, let's take quality, ISO 9001, that first came out of a British standard 5750, and that was produced in 1979. I suspect some of you watching or listening in might not even have been born, and that was the year after I started work in engineering. And certainly we've moved on a heck of a long way since 1979. So we need to make sure that our standards are updated to reflect the increasingly complex environments that we all work in. One of the comments that we pick up sometimes from clients, particularly about the older standards, is they read perfectly well and are quite understandable if you're a manufacturing organisation. But if you are in a service industry, if you are office-based and don't have a manufacturing base, they maybe don't seem quite as relevant. Well, that's been taken into account in all the new standards, and the aim being that they should be just as relevant to you, whatever sector you may need to be in. There's new sections on corporate governance, and also push from industry for easier integration of all of the different systems. Now, this new standard has followed this Annex SL format, but not quite. So if you've got 14,001 2015 and you are transitioning your 50,001 system, or thinking of implementing 50,001 2018 to sit alongside your 14,001 2015 standard, there are a couple of differences. Why they've gone away from this, I don't know. When the draft came out, I did comment, I did ask the question, but I would guess I was just one voice among thousands, and they took no notice of me. Anyway, that's by the by. We have to work with what we're given, and as we go through, I'll explain what those differences are. You'll be familiar with this slide, Annex SL. This is the sort of blank format that was produced in 2011 now, I think it was, nearly, what, nine and a half years ago probably, was produced as a format, as a template for all new standards. And if you've got any of the other standards, 9 or 14, maybe 45,001, you'll recognise all of those areas. And the bits that we are interested in are clauses 4 to 10 because they are the auditable clauses. That's taken from the slide that all of these standards are based on the Deming cycle, the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle, and that is a slide just showing the elements of 50,001 set out under the various sections. I tend to prefer to set it out like this. I always find it quite funny, actually. As maybe there were people sat in here today, I sit in and listen to other people's webinars. I sit in and listen to other certification bodies' webinars. I sit in and listen to other consultants' webinars. And thank you, Scott. Somebody on the UK panel for 50,000, I can show you that all comments were considered and not ignored. Thank you. Okay, maybe not ignored, but we're considered and rejected. And maybe you can give us a little bit of context as we go along as to maybe why things were done slightly differently. I'd be interested. I think you're the first person I've spoken to that sat in on the UK panel for this. So apologies if I was dismissing you out of hand. That certainly wasn't my intention, Scott, I can assure you. I was just about to say that I've seen this slide crop up in other people's presentations. I like this slide. It's one that I produced, but I think it sets out the Plan, Do, Check, Act in a linear format, but actually shows the Plan, Do, Check, Act and the various sections of the standard set out, the various subsections. So again, just a little slide to show that the idea is that all of these standards share common elements. They all have a number of areas that all sit together. And in fact, I did a webinar with my colleague Terry Fisher a couple of weeks ago about integration of standards. That's coming up again if you want to have another look at that or are interested in sitting in on that. We run a webinar on how to look at integrating different standards and looking at the common areas across all of these standards. So how do these standards fit together? 50,001 focuses obviously entirely on energy performance improvement, whereas 14,001 addresses all significant environmental impacts of an organisation, including energy. So I have a number of people that I work with on 14,001 who've looked at 50,001 and talked to me about 50,001. Now, I've not, at the end of the day, it's not for me to tell them one way or the other. I'm just an assessor. But I can support their decision that because energy is for them isn't a significant issue, and maybe they have other much wider environmental issues, that actually for now they can manage the side of the energy that they need to manage using their existing 14,001 system. What I tend to say is that if an organisation's most significant impact is energy, then probably 50,001 is an appropriate standard to think about. And certainly thinking about some of the businesses and some of the organisations I work with on 50,001, energy usage, energy management is clearly a significant issue for them. And basically what it does, it takes energy management to a higher level, to the next level, if you like, more than just including it within a 14,001 system. It gives it a much higher profile and allows you to better resource the improvements that are needed. A couple of areas that are in there that just to clarify, this is a slide that I also have included in the past in other standards. So when I ran the 14,001 transition slides, this was in there as well. So this is showing you that some of the terminology has changed. None of the standards now really talk about preventive action. Preventive action has been dropped as a clause itself, and it's generally thought that the areas covering preventive action now are the planning phases, where we actually look at the areas at the start of the standards, start of clause 6, so things like risks and opportunities, and we'll look at what might go wrong, the things that could happen, the things that can get in the way, the things that can help us, and we plan to either maximize the opportunities or to mitigate the potential issues from the risks, and that's deemed to be the preventive action, although it's not called that, it's there as planning. To be fair, I still have a number of clients that in their systems, they still refer to corrective action and preventive action. And again, if you wish to do that, far be it from me to say you shouldn't. And I certainly would not be the first to criticise people if they wish to use some of the older terminology. And then the other important one to think about is energy performance. We're going to come on to that a little bit later on because it's an area that's been quite controversial with this standard. And towards the end, I want to address some of those concerns. But energy performance, which is, yes, Anna, easy to follow slide pack. Will it be shared afterwards? Yes, it will. You might have joined us just after we started. I did mention that we'll be sending you all of the slides probably early next week now. It's Thursday today, so probably early next week we'll be sending out an email with all of the slides in. And as I say, there's a recording, or there will be a recording on YouTube. So energy performance is really what the standard's looking at, not necessarily absolute energy usage, energy performance, and we'll look at what that means in a short time. So we're now on to what's going to make up the bulk of our presentation, certainly for the next half hour, probably a little bit longer. We're going to go through the slides themselves. We're going to start with clause 4 because, as I said earlier, the clauses 1, 2, and 3 are not the auditable clauses. They just set the scene. They talk about the scope of the standard, what it is the standard's setting out to achieve, and have some terms and definitions in there. And if you want to have a look at all of the terms and definitions used, then obviously you need to have a look at that section within the standard. So context of the organisation. If you've got 14,001, 9,000, you'll understand what this is all about. If you haven't and you're starting, if you're an organisation that's just got 50,001, 2011 and no other standards, this will be a new clause to you. As I say, if you've got 14,001 particularly, there'll be very, very little work needs to be done really, because most of it will already be there. But what context is all about is determining the issues, both internally and externally, that are relevant to the organisation's purpose, are relevant to what it is you're doing, and issues that affect the ability of you to achieve the intended outcome. Now, we said earlier that the intended outcome, the key intended outcome, is the improvement in energy performance. So the way I like to think about context, it's fairly simple. There are things that are happening both internally within your organisation and externally that are going to help you achieve that outcome, and there are things that are going to get in the way. So risks and opportunities, to me, are as simple as the things that are going to help you are the opportunities, and we need to maximise on those, grasp those opportunities with both hands. The things that are going to get in the way, they're the risks, and they're the things that we need to think about mitigating and controlling to make sure that those risks don't prevent us from achieving the outcome. So really, getting this bit right here feeds directly into clause 6.1, which takes us straight into risks and opportunities. A lot of people don't quite understand what this is all about. And to me, it's a fairly straightforward process, as I've just identified. Right, I'm going to come on to some of the questions. There's a little bit on ESOS and things like that. So I'm going to cover that towards the end, Carl, if that's okay. Because, yes, I can answer that question. So we'll look at that towards the end. It's a little bit out of context, no pun intended, for where we are just at the moment. So by making sure you get the context bit right, it's all about making sure that the management system, the energy management system, which is what EnMS stands for, as opposed to EMS, which is environmental, make sure that your system focuses on the things that matter. There's no right and wrong way of doing it. I've put this slide in because one or two people said, well, can you give me some ideas of what we ought to include? And this isn't a complete list by any means. This is just my thoughts as a starter, if you like, some things that you might consider. Again, the standard doesn't say you have to split them into these areas. This is just my thought, and it doesn't really matter. How you do this is entirely up to you, so long as you make sure and can demonstrate that you've covered the key issues. So energy related, external issues, and internal issues. Now, interested parties is one of the areas where this standard has diverted, if you like, away from particularly 14,001 in its handling of compliance issues. Because within 14,001, there is a clause 613, if I remember rightly. Clause 6.1.3 talks about compliance obligations, and it's a clause that's there to make sure that an organisation has covered all of the things that it's committed it to do, whether it's a legislative issue or whether it's something that the organisation has agreed to take on board voluntarily. And that's fine, that works fine. However, for some reason, the people that wrote this standard decided that that wasn't the way forward, and decided that compliance obligations would sit under interested parties. Now, I can see the logic in that for virtually every compliance obligation, whether it's a piece of legislation or whether it is something that you as a business have decided you're going to do, there will be an interested party. There'll be somebody somewhere who is interested in whether you're meeting that obligation. So why not put it under interested parties? So I can see that. However, part of me says that the guys who did 14,001 got in first and set the tone, and maybe in the spirit of Annex SL, maybe we should have stuck to the same. However, the point I am going to make is if you're doing things in the 14,001 way and you have a legal register or a compliance register that's set out in the way that 14,001 shows, then doing it that way won't count against you when we come to audit this standard. So it doesn't really matter which way around you do it. And I've said the same to the guys who might have 14,001. If you want to do it in the 50,001 2018 way, fine, doesn't make any difference. What's more important is that you've done what the standard requires that you do, you've met those requirements. What clause you pigeonhole it into doesn't really matter. But at the end of the day, this is about ensuring that you have an understanding of what people are expecting of you, and then deciding which you are going to comply with. And obviously, if it's legal requirements and the questions that Carl was asking about, ESOS and SECR, they are legal requirements that have to be complied with in one form or another. So those are the things that you can't choose to ignore. This is a list of who they are. Go over this pretty quickly. We've all seen slides like this before. Again, not an exhaustive list, just a rough idea as to who they might be. Another of the key changes in the new standard refers to the scope of the system. Now, don't get confused with clause 1 within the standard. That's also a headed scope. That is the scope of the standard itself. That tells you a little bit about ISO 50001 itself. Your scope, in other words, the boundaries of your energy management system, come under clause 4.3. And it asks you to clarify and document that clarification of the physical and organizational boundaries of your system. You can include the entirety, you can include all your organization, or you can include a part of the organization. And I have a number of clients that haven't included every facility they've got. However, there are a number of areas that you have to take into account if you're going to miss out certain areas. So if you're going to miss out an area, if that area has a unique energy type in there or a unique energy source, perhaps, you can't just ignore that, because the scope has to include all energy types used. So if you think, you know what, I've got this facility in another part of the country, it's fairly unique, it's got a particular energy source, I don't really want to have to manage that properly, it's not very important to me, I'll draw a line around that. You can't do that, because you're not allowed to exclude a particular energy type within that. So you have to make sure that the scope of the system, if you're going to exclude anywhere, it hasn't got a unique energy type. The other thing that's caused a little bit of a question from a number of people is you now must have the authority to control energy efficiency, energy use, and energy consumption within the scope. This has been a little bit problematic for people who've got sites that maybe are in fully resourced offices, so they may rent a corner of a much larger facility, and maybe the rent or whatever it is they're paying, the lease costs fully include energy. They can't be given a breakdown of the energy they're using. Now, the question I've had asked is, does that give you the authority to control energy efficiency, energy use, and energy consumption within the scope? I've tended to say, do you have the ability to turn the lights on and off? Do you have the ability to look at the type of equipment you're using in there? Is it possible to discuss the possibility of submetering that corner of the office, although that wouldn't necessarily be a deal breaker? Do you have the ability, for instance, to alter the heating or cooling in your corner of the office? So all of these are things to think about. And if I'm being brutally honest, I've yet to come across somebody who we can't make a convincing argument to say, yes, although you're in a corner of somebody else's office, you do still have the authority to control and manage the energy efficiency of what you're doing. However, it's worth chatting to your assessor if you feel that might be an issue. And then finally, the energy management system itself basically says you have to establish, implement, maintain, and continually improve the energy management system. And that's basically sums up that slide. And the important bit in red, all of the new standards again require that not just energy performance improves, but you have also to improve the system. And that is one of the policy commitments that we'll look at fairly shortly. Moving on to clause 5, just a little bit of a word of warning. We probably are going to overrun slightly because I've been going half an hour. And we're already at 32 minutes into the webinar, so we probably are going to overrun a little bit. So if you have any questions that you've got that you might want answering, you think, well, we might have to duck out before it's finished, think about asking them now, and I'll try and cover them. If you just make a point in there to say that I might need to leave after an hour, can I ask this now? Okay, leadership and commitment. One of the interesting things in the new standards is that they all use the term leadership rather than senior management or top management commitment. So one of the things that we're looking at is that it's a little bit more proactive, is this leadership. It's not just, well, we committed to it. I once had a managing director of a fairly large blue chip company sat opposite me, I won't say who, in an audit, and it was one of the new standards. We were doing a transition actually to 14,001. And he actually said to me, I'm not quite sure what all this leadership stuff's all about. He said, I sit in at the management review and I've signed the policy. What more do you want me to do? And that might just about have been acceptable under the old standards, but that certainly isn't showing any type of leadership at all. So therefore, leadership now is I suppose it's the old cliche of walking the walk and not just talking the talk. And a lot of the stuff you can see there is taken straight out of the standard. So it's basically making sure that the energy management system itself is not managed in isolation. It's not just one person's job. It's not, oh, Fred looks after that down the corridor. I don't know what he does, but he seems to manage it well. We just let him get on with it. That's not what it's all about really now. It's about making sure that the energy management system forms a part of whatever it is the company is doing, sitting alongside quality and environment and health and safety and all the other things that are there. I am just going to answer Eamon's question. It says, and this is now, must all energy types used not mean that within the part of the organisation chosen, all energy sources have to be included? In other words, can't exclude an energy type within the boundary, rather than mean the boundary has to include every energy type within the organisation. I'm tempted to say both. So therefore, the energy, the boundary of the system has to include everything on your site. So you can't exclude a site or you can't exclude an energy source. So in other words, I think we're probably both right, and it works both ways. If a particular site that you're going to exclude has a particular type of energy, that can't be excluded. Equally well, if you are a single site operation, and for instance, you still use, let's take an extreme example, you're still using coal somewhere on site, you can't draw a line around that and say, I'm going to exclude that coal. So I think we're both right, if I'm honest. So I think, yes, in other words, can. I think you're right, Eamon, and I hope that answers your question. I've waffled a little bit there, but hopefully that's covered that. Now, top management is defined as a person or group of people who directs and control an organisation at the highest level. So in other words, there isn't a set answer to who they are. Usually it would be at board level, but the one sort of thing we say is if the system has been implemented at a business unit within a much larger organisation, top management would then be seen as being the senior management on that business unit site. There might be shown on, say, an organisational chart, a dotted line to somebody higher up, maybe at board level, at group level perhaps, but certainly top management would be seen as being within that business unit. And ultimately, the standard requires the top management to take accountability for the effectiveness of the management system. The buck stops at that level. So the energy policy, we have to have a policy. It can be an integrated policy. I have a number of clients who have who've got 14,001 and 50,001, and they have a combined energy and environment policy. That's quite acceptable, so long as the policy ticks the commitments required by both standards. And there are a couple of unique energy performance commitments that are unique to this standard that wouldn't be covered just by renaming your environmental policy and energy and environmental policy. So it's got to be appropriate to what you do, stop you pinching somebody else's. I like to think that I can read somebody's policy and have a good idea what they do. If I didn't know anything about the business, maybe the policy should give me an inkling into what it is you do. The policy needs to set the framework for setting and reviewing energy objectives. There needs to be a commitment in there to ensure the availability of information and any resources that people might need to allow both the company and, if necessary, individuals to achieve the company-wide objectives and particularly the energy targets. There needs to be a commitment to satisfy applicable legal and other requirements. And again, this standard's drifted away slightly from the 14,001 usage of compliance obligations. Again, if you call things legal and other requirements, if you call them compliance obligations, it doesn't matter a jot. You can call them what you like. Again, as long as you've covered them, that doesn't really matter. So if, for instance, you want to talk about committing to satisfying applicable compliance requirements, then I'm quite happy with that. You don't have to use that terminology. There needs to be commitment to continual improvement. Now, not just continual improvement of the management system, but particularly commitment to continual improvement in energy performance. And as I say, we'll look at that shortly. There has to be a statement in there, or the policy has to support the design of processes, the design of new equipment, the design of whatever it is, and indeed procurement of anything that's being bought, design and procurement for energy efficiency. It needs to be documented and available to interested parties as required, and also communicated widely and understood internally. One of the other key changes from the old standard was very, very clear that there had to be an energy manager, there had to be a named individual who had to demonstrate that they had the technical capability, they had the technical competency to be able to be the business's energy manager. Now that's gone. Along with all of the other standards, they've all got rid of a quality manager and environmental manager. When I say got rid of, they've got rid of the requirement for them. Hopefully you've not sacked them all. So they've got rid of the requirement to have that. Now, if you want to maintain that role, you can do. It's just that the standard doesn't formally require it anymore. However, what is required, particularly in this standard, and I think it's unique to this standard, I don't think I've seen it in any of the other standards, there has to be an energy team. Now, I have had the question asked more than once, can we have a team of one? Now, my understanding is, whilst the standard doesn't strictly prohibit that, I would look very unfavorably of an organisation that had an energy team of one, because what the intention of the standard here is to clearly make sure that all of the relevant people within the organisation who can influence, who have an input into energy management, are represented within that management team, the energy management team. So it might be production staff, there might be some maintenance staff in there might be some purchasing staff, there may be people that drop in and out the team dependent on what the team is particularly focusing on, and there might be an energy manager who still chairs the whole thing. But ultimately, it's about making sure that there is a cross-functional group of people who are overseeing the improvement of energy performance on a company site. That's what the intention is. Now, if you can persuade me that one person in isolation can do that, then good luck. I've always got an open ear, and I've yet to be proved wrong. So I would always expect to see more than one person involved in the management of energy. Moving on to the planning phase, some of these areas haven't changed dramatically, some have. So basically what the planning section is all about is taking the issues that we thought about in clauses 4.1 and 4.2, which was the context and needs of interested parties, taking those and making sure that those issues are addressed within the management system, to make sure, as we see, and I'm not going to read them out because I've mentioned it before, to make sure that the system achieves its intended outcome. And it's all about preventing or reducing undesired effects. And you could argue that what I haven't said there is also grasping the opportunities that are presented as well, and making sure that ultimately the system achieves continual improvement. So there is this section on actions to address risks and opportunities. And if I'm honest, some of the people who I've seen who've transitioned from the old standard to the new standard, I've had a couple of cases where this has been missing. It's not if they've got 14,001, but if they've not, this is an area that they think they can just gloss over. And really, it's not quite as simple as that. It is about taking those areas that are that you've identified, as I said earlier, the things that are going to help you achieve continual improvement, the things that are going to get in the way. They're the risks, there's the opportunities. You need to identify those. It's a little bit like in 14,001 in environmental management, there are risks that are not directly applicable to aspects. And I've had the same issue with 14,001. I've had people say to me, when I ask about risks and opportunities, they wheel out their aspects register. And they say, what about risks that are not directly applicable to aspects? And they look at me blankly. So this is the same, really. This is all about making sure that we've covered everything. It's a little bit like a safety net, really. Have we covered everything that's a risk and everything that's an opportunity? Now, I don't want Scott to think that this is a dig at those people involved in the UK panel. It's not at all. Again, I personally feel that this section of the clause, if you're working through the standard, this clause I think sits slightly out of kilter with where it would sit if you were viewing this clause as a process. Doesn't really matter again where it sits, it doesn't matter what order you do things in, but at this point within, you may have some objectives coming out of the risks and opportunities, but generally the energy targets and planning to achieve them come a little bit later on in 2 or 3 slides time. So, but this is where the standard places them, this is where we'll address them. It's a policy commitment, so a policy commitment to improve the system itself and to improve energy performance, and of course we want to see some objectives that are going to help us achieve that. The objectives have to be consistent with the policy. The policy commits to improvement in energy performance, so we need to have some objectives that will point us in that direction. The objectives, if practicable, need to be measurable. Now, yes, we are. Can we talk about SEUs? And that's what I've just been saying, that actually it mentions SEUs as this slide, but we're talking about SEUs in a couple of slides' time. They need to be monitored, they need to be communicated, and they need to be updated, the objectives. And obviously, for each of the objectives, there needs to be a plan. Who's going to do what, when's it going to be done, what resources are we going to require, etc., etc. One of the misconceptions is that when we come on to SEUs, which are significant energy users, I've had a number of people say to me, and indeed, off the record, one or two of my colleagues have asked me this question. The standard does not require that there is an objective set for every significant energy use. Just in the same way that in 14,001, there doesn't have to be an objective for every significant aspect. The standard itself says, and I think it brings it up in the annex really, rather than in the standard itself. It says that SEU should be considered, which is why on my bullet point I've got the word the objectives must consider the SEUs. There doesn't have to be an objective for every SEU. If there weren't any, so in other words, there were a whole load of objectives but didn't reflect back to any of the SEUs, then we might have a problem, but they don't all have to be covered. And I think the intention is that over time, yes, you would gradually get to cover them all, but you don't have to cover them all right at the start. The energy review is a little bit like the energy version of the 14,001 aspects and impacts evaluation process. So it's all about looking to see where we sit in terms of how we use energy, both how we've used energy in the past, how we currently use energy now, and maybe a little bit about where we think we might be going in terms of our future energy use and energy needs. So it's sort of crossing the road and looking left, looking right, and looking straight ahead of us as well. So we look upstream, we look downstream, and we look straight across the stream, whichever analogy works best for you. It's all about identifying the types of energy that we use, and then looking at basically what our significant energy usage is. Now, an SEU, in environment, we tend to have all sorts of different ways of identifying things that might be considered significant. In energy, it's a little bit simpler. It's a numbers game, more or less. Which facilities, which processes, which piece of equipment, whatever we're going to choose, which of those use the most energy? And they then become our significant energy uses. There isn't a set way of doing it. It's entirely up to you to develop a process for doing this and document that process. But for each of the SEUs, we then need to think about what are the relevant variables. So an SEU might be, for instance, so let's take a particular example. If it's a manufacturing organization, my background is in engineering, and I'm actually a metallurgist if I go right the way back. So let's take a big heat treatment facility in engineering, huge great oven, gas powered oven that's used for heat treating components. That probably on its own would be a significant energy use. We can work out how much energy it's using because it's submetered. There's a meter on there that tells us how much gas is going into the thing itself. We need to identify what is it that affects how much gas that we use. Now, clearly, you're going to tell me how much work we put through it, the temperature it's set at, maybe the amount of times we have to open and close the door. Can we keep components in for a long time? Are we forever opening and closing the doors? These are all the variables that can identify how much we use. So for each SEU, we have two things. We have a variable, that's the thing that actually determines how much energy is used. And then we have what are called static factors. And the static factors are the things that don't change. So if we take another example, say air conditioning units within your office, the static factors are the air conditioning units themselves. They might have been in place for 10 years. They don't change. The control systems are the same. They're part of a building management system that's been around for a long time. The only thing that changes, the key variable, is the weather. Now here in the UK, we've just had a few weeks of nice warm sunny weather. Today is a bit duller. It was raining yesterday, so we've probably altered our heating or cooling controls. That's a key variable. So we've two things to think about within SEUs. The static factors, they're the things that don't change, and the key variables, they're the things that will affect how much energy an SEU actually uses. Can we talk a little bit about SEUs and why it's best to limit these with respect to subs? Well, you can have as many SEUs as you like. Again, it's up to you to break them down into groups. So for instance, one example, I work with a university who've got 50,001. I won't tell you which one, but it's quite a large university in the north of England. They've got 182 buildings. So they started out, they can meter every single building. So they started out with an Excel spreadsheet that had 182 rows on it. Now, they could have said that every single one of those buildings was an SEU, but it would have just been a complete nonsense to try and manage that. So what they did, they applied the 80-20 rule, and they said, we're going to start working down, we're going to sort of look at this cumulatively, and we're going to start going down and adding buildings on. And when we get to 80% of our total energy usage, we're going to stop. And those, whatever buildings are within that 80%, they're going to be our significant energy users. And guess what? It wasn't a million miles out. It was probably one building different from actually being 20% of their facilities use 80%. Now, that's how they chose to do it because it needed to be manageable. But it's up to you to break it down into what you consider you can measure, you can monitor, and you can influence. But in terms of limiting them, it's really up to you. The more SEUs you have, the more complicated your system is going to be. But equally well, you can't go the other way and just have, say, one SEU that covers the whole of our manufacturing facility, because we might run into problems, as we'll see shortly when we talk about performance indicators. So the energy review itself has to actually be documented, and the methodology for documenting that should also be documented as well. So energy performance indicators. Now, what we need to think about here is ENPIs. We need to make sure that we have appropriate energy performance indicators that will allow us to demonstrate that we're improving our energy performance. So the performance indicators themselves will be chosen in order to reflect the sort of performance improvements. Now, the selection of these is critical to making sure that you can demonstrate performance improvement. And in many, many cases, whatever you've decided as the key variable, that tends to be the thing that you judge the ENPI against. So for instance, if you are looking at components that are produced and maybe a machine, the amount of energy a machine uses is dictated by the amount of work it undertakes, the number of components it produces. Clearly, the performance indicator might be energy per widget produced. You may choose, in an office, you might have the number of staff in the office. So you might have kilowatt hours of energy per staff member. You might have kilowatt hours per square meter of floor space. There are a number of things that you can think about choosing. What we try and steer you away from is having a performance indicator that is a simple meter reading, a simple absolute energy reading. When we have problems with people demonstrating, of not being able to demonstrate, should I say, improvements in energy performance, where they're just measuring absolute energy usage, that's where they start to have the problems. Because if your production levels go up, your energy usage goes up, and if your only measure is absolute energy usage, then you're going to show an issue. So the selection of these is fairly critical to identifying and being able to demonstrate energy performance. Now we have to measure performance against something, and we measure performance against the baseline. Now, one of the things that I struggled a little bit with as a concept when we first looked at this was the fact that the baseline is movable. Now, I always thought of a baseline as being a fixed point in time, and yes, in a way it is. So the baseline would be, if I was implementing this myself now in a business, I would probably take 2 or 3 years ago as a baseline. So where were we 2 or 3 years ago perhaps, and against which I can start to demonstrate continual improvement. What I like to see as an assessor is a full year between the baseline and where we are now, so we can start to demonstrate some continual improvement. But basically the baseline is a suitable period of time, taking into account all the different operating cycles, the regulatory requirements, or any other variables. Usually it's taken into as a calendar year, or maybe a financial year, but it's a 12-month period. It takes into account the weather, takes into account sales cycles, takes into account production cycles, all sorts of things like that. And the baseline talks about where we are at this particular point in time, and we would use our ENPIs at that point to actually set the baseline. So this is how all our processes are performing at this set point in time. We then need to come back and amend that baseline if there are some changes. So the major changes tend to be, or the main changes I've seen are if there are changes to the static factors. So bearing in mind I talked about the static factors being the equipment in most cases. If things change, so let's say you rip out all your air conditioning unit and implement something completely new, you put a brand new building management system in, whole new, all singing, all dancing air conditioning system. Those static factors have changed, and we may need to go back and revisit the baseline and reset the baseline so that we then take it into account the changes that we've made. I also said that all of these standards talk about planning, and this is a section that is going to make quite a difference. We have to plan now for the collection of energy data. This is where we decide what we're going to have to measure to capture the data that we're going to need. So we've talked about the energy review, we've talked about the baseline, we've talked about the performance indicators. What do we need? What do we need to think about? What do we need to plan in order to be able to get the data we need? Do we need some additional sub-metering? Do we need to have anything that's calibrated? How do we collect the data we're going to need? And this then takes us from here back into, or forward should I say, into clause 9.1, where we start to then actually collect the data. I'm going to skip through some of these because I'm conscious that I've gone way over time, and we're nearly at an hour, and I'm only on clause 7. So I'm going to skip through a couple of these because a lot of these haven't changed. If you have a question about these slides, ask me, otherwise I'll skip over them pretty quickly. Competency hasn't really changed. It's about making sure that if you're asking somebody to do a job, you need to make sure that they're competent to carry it out, and that might mean training, it might not. Awareness, very similar to the old standard. It's a little bit about making sure that people who are under your control are aware of a number of things, including the policy, the commitments that you've made, how they can contribute towards that, and the implications, if you like, of not conforming. Communication, again, important. The bit that I want to point out is the 3rd bullet point, particularly because this is, I think, maybe with a slight difference, but a similar concept, if you like, in health and safety. There has to be a mechanism by which staff and anybody else, visitors or contractors, can give you input, can give you feedback on how you may make improvements to your system or to your overall energy performance improvement. So that mechanism needs to be in place, whether it's a suggestion scheme, whether you hold employee forums, whether you sit down with your contractors at an induction and say to them, if you see anything you think we can improve on, for goodness sake, tell us. Doesn't really matter. There has to be something in place to allow that feedback loop to begin. Documented information, again, based on the 2011 version, document control, documentation, documents, records. The standard doesn't use that term. The standard uses documented information. The sad individual that I am, I went through the standard, and this is an important table to bear in mind. this has taken every section of the standard that has the phrase documented information in it, and I've put it into a slide. I've used the term documents and records because I think it helps us picture what the thing actually might be, but the standard doesn't use that terminology, but I think it's helpful, and certainly people have told me they think it is. One or two people have said to me, so if I use this as a tick box and I can go through this and show that my system includes all of this in some sort of documented form, be it hard copy or electronic, am I there or thereabouts? And I think the answer probably is yes. If you can say that you've got all of this covered within your system, you won't be a million miles away. And of course, I've put a little safety net at the bottom, plus anything else that you might deem necessary, including documents of an external origin that might be customer related, might be supplier related, might be something that sits outside of your business but sits maybe within the group that you're part of. Whatever, it doesn't really matter. It's just there to capture anything else. Skip through these pretty quickly again. A couple of things I want to dwell on, but basically operational planning. We need to control the processes that we've got that are relative to our significant energy usage. So it's a no-brainer to me. If you've got something that's using a lot of energy, you need to make sure you're controlling it. So in other words, if we go back to the maybe a heat treatment oven, what documents have we got? How do we control? What process controls have we got in place to control how that is managed? Is it just down to the knowledge of Fred, who runs the thing, and it's how he feels on a particular morning, or do we have some set criteria to say if we're putting this component through, it needs to be set at this temperature, maintained for 20 minutes, and then we can drop the temperature by 50 degrees centigrade to that temperature, etc., etc. What level of controls do we actually need? What criteria have we got for how that process is managed? And then to make sure that the relevant people who need to know, who need to operate that process, who are involved in that process, they know what that information is, what that criteria is, and how to access it. Part of that process is also making sure that we are in control of any changes, and if, for instance, I don't know, maybe a customer changes a requirement on something that can affect how we manage that particular process, then that we control how that happens. It doesn't just happen. It doesn't just suddenly one morning an operator decides to do something slightly different. We need to just make sure that we are controlling that process and making sure we're controlling those changes. The next two sections fit together, design and procurement, really. They're separate clauses, but I think they go hand in hand. It's a policy commitment that we as a business commit to considering energy performance improvements in the design of new, modified and renovated facilities, equipment, systems and processes. I've lost count of the times I've spoken to people who manage systems, manage things within businesses, and they say to me, by the time I found out about it, it was too late. They'd already decided what the lighting they were going to have, what the heating was going to be. This, that's not what it's all about. This is a system that should be used. If you're sitting down to develop an extension to your building and you're going to put some new lighting, some new heating, some new equipment in there that's going to use energy, for goodness sake, use this system to make sure that you've considered that energy performance, both in the design of the new facilities, the design of the new processes, but also on the procurement of any equipment that you might be buying to fit in with that new process or that new equipment. If you're doing that and you're going out to tender, you have to inform the potential suppliers that energy performance is one of the evaluation criteria to be used. That's something that we will audit, something that we will ask you to demonstrate. And also we ask you to demonstrate that you're communicating the specifications for that procured equipment. Do you have in your own mind what the minimum performance specifications might be for that procured equipment? And that also in a way applies to the procurement of energy itself, because obviously energy is something that you're buying as well. Now, performance evaluation, not going to spend too much time on this. It's just the same as the other standards. We've talked about at the end of clause 6, looking at planning for this. This is where we're now starting to take measurements. We're starting to gather data. We're starting to think about how we're actually performing. And that's where we, will you get a certificate? No. Sorry, we don't issue certificates for sitting in on webinars because it's an attendance. For all I know, you could be doing something else. So no, I'm afraid there are no certificates for attending webinars. We only issue certificates where people have had to demonstrate a knowledge and understanding at the end of something. So I'm sorry about that. There's not a problem with you detailing that you've done it as part of a CPD, but actually we can't issue formal certificates. So performance evaluation, again, these are the sorts of things we need to take into account. A lot of this we've already done at clause 6.6, how we're going to monitor things, what equipment we're going to use, how we're going to evaluate the results. Internal audit is, so evaluative compliance first. I always find this slightly amusing that the standard doesn't have any a specific clause on compliance obligations, but it has a clause on evaluating that compliance. It's evaluating conformity with legal and other requirements that sits within the needs of interested parties. So it's about evaluating, are we doing what we're supposed to be doing, whether it's a legal issue, whether it's something we've committed to do. Are we meeting our compliance obligations? Are we conforming to what we're supposed to conform to? And don't worry, I haven't forgotten the question about ESOS and the like. Internal audit hasn't changed. If you've got any other standards, it's just the same. There is a requirement to carry out internal auditing. Hasn't changed from the old standard to the new standard. Has to be an audit program that takes into account the perceived risk. However, when we're auditing, we have to consider the ability of the system to produce energy performance. We have to audit internally our own energy performance. Are we improving that performance? Management review, again, hasn't really changed. There's one thing that's moved within management review. The old standard, the 2011 standard, required the forecasting of future energy use, energy performance. That used to sit within management review. It now sits within the energy review itself. Again, if I'm honest, I'm not bothered where it sits, so long as it's something you can demonstrate that you've actually covered. So yeah, inputs, outputs, lifted from the standard, fairly standard set of requirements there. Again, we just need to ensure that that is taking place. And then improvement. The improvement, the main area is determining opportunities for improvement and implementing actions to achieve the intended outcomes of the system. So making sure that we're improving the suitability, adequacy, effectiveness of the system itself, but having this huge focus on improving our energy performance. Now, I'll get the easy one out the way first, which is non-conformity. So if you're raising non-conformities as a part of internal auditing, if there are non-conformities coming out of our audits as a certification body, you have to deal with them. You have to take a graded approach, so the level of action taken needs to be appropriate to the magnitude of the effect, but it needs to be documented, the nature, the actions that you've taken and the results of those actions. Now, you might wonder why I've immediately jumped to a new standard. And I think this standard is changing as well. It hasn't at the moment. ISO 50003 is a standard that applies to us, not to you. It applies to certification bodies. So the standard itself is called Energy Management Systems Requirements for Bodies Providing Audit and Certification of Energy Management Systems. And a few years ago, when this was published, it brought in this concept that a major non-conformance would be issued if a client or if a body that we were auditing could not demonstrate continual improvement in energy performance. And a number of people in the industry accused the powers that be of bringing this requirement in by the back door. Because 50,001 applied to us and not to the businesses themselves, they argued that because 50,001 2011 didn't formally require improvement in energy performance, because that wasn't in the standard per se as an auditable clause, it was being brought in by a back door. Now, actually, if you read the scope of 50,001 2011, it did say the intention of the standard is to achieve continual improvement. However, this new standard has brought this in. So clause 10.2, and it's a very, very short clause, it literally states that you will demonstrate continual improvement in energy performance. And if you remember back to earlier on, it is a policy commitment. So twice now, the standard clearly tells us that as an organisation, we have to continually improve our energy performance. Now, just turning to the standard itself, so clause 10.2, the organisation shall continually improve the suitability, adequacy and effectiveness of the management system. Full stop. The organisation shall demonstrate continual energy performance improvement, full stop. There's no sort of watering down of that. There's no, if you're doing this, if you're not doing that. It is a fairly straightforward commitment. You must do that. If you failure to demonstrate compliance with a clause of the standard, failure to demonstrate compliance with a key policy commitment is a major non-conformance. So if you are not demonstrating continual improvement using the performance indicators that you've set against the baseline, and continual is obviously in an upward direction. The interesting bit is it's the word continual and not the word continuous. So in my mind, if there's been a little bit of a blip, if there's been a little bit of a slowing down or even ceasing of improvement, but gradually, but generally the trend is upwards, I'm okay with that. Now I believe, and I've seen the draft, 50,003 is changing, and that might be changing, but I don't want to get into things that are not yet out there in the real world at the moment. So as far as we're concerned at the moment, if you can't demonstrate continual improvement in energy performance, as the slide says in front of you, you will get a major non-conformance. So there we go. And that slide sort of demonstrates it. So examples of improvement: total energy consumption decreases over time. I still have a number of people that insist on showing me absolute energy usage, and that's fine. If they're using less energy than this time last year, that is considered an improvement. But really, we're looking at energy consumption might increase, but the measure that's used within the performance indicator has shown an improvement in performance. So you might use more energy because you've produced more components over the year, but actually you've done that more efficiently. And the performance indicator, the energy per widget has improved, but the overall absolute energy consumption has increased, but the performance has got better. And it's performance that we're measuring, not absolute energy usage. Now, the transition process, it's the same as it was for 14,001. And I've just realized, and I've just made a note, I haven't altered this slide, although I altered the slide earlier on. The expiry date there is now wrong. It's the 31st of August 2022. I'll get that changed before the slides get sent out. There are three ways of transitioning. You can transition as a separate reassessment done at a reassessment. So at the third year, at the recertification visit, you can have the transition done then. You can transition at a surveillance, or you can transition at any time at all. We can provide pre-assessments. I've done a small number of clients where they've asked me to go in and just do a one-day, off the record, if you like, documented review. I say off the record, it doesn't affect the audit process, just to have a look at, a bit like taking your car for pre-MOT, in other words. So in other words, does it look right? Are we there? Are you happy with everything? Before we then go in and do the actual assessment. That can be done. It's not part of the overall assessment. If you want to do that, speak to your assessor or speak to NQA sales. But prior to a transition audit, you should be contacted about a month before the visit. There is a form, TR006. I think you can probably get it from our website, but there is a transition form to be completed, which is a gap analysis that takes you through the changes and shows you what needs to be done, and enables you to use it as a tick box, if you like, to show you've covered everything. And we do use that as part of the audit process. So finally. So the new standard, it's adopted more or less the Annex SL format. It's clarified and given a little bit of additional guidance in energy review, what an energy review is all about, what needs to be included. It's talked a little bit more about the normalization of performance indicators and the baseline. An ENB is an energy baseline. There's some additional clarification in this new section on the energy data collection plan and related requirements. And as I say, performance indicators and baseline text has been clarified to provide a better understanding. So, moving on from here, it is an opportunity to take a fresh look at your energy management system. Have a look at our website. There's a huge amount of information on there. It's all freely available to download. I've written most of it. It talks in great detail. There's some guidance on transition. There's some guidance on the clauses. There's some additional guidance that we've seen in here. Highlight the key changes that you're going to need to make and identify those as an opportunity for you to improve yourself. Make the changes that need to be made to reflect the new structure. Implement the new requirements on leadership, risk and context. Look at the current controls you've got in place. Assume that every control that you've got might need to be amended. Don't work the other way and say, well, actually, we'll assume that it can all stay the same unless we prove otherwise. It tends to work best if you assume we need to change everything unless we can think otherwise or can prove otherwise. But review the effectiveness of all the current controls. And like I've said, assume that every control may be changed. And finally, carry out a gap analysis, either by asking us to come in and do that, and that's not mandatory, that's entirely an optional, but certainly you will have to carry out the gap analysis using our form TR006, which is available widely. If you haven't got hold of one, give me a shout and I can always sort you one out. So I think I've only got one question that's outstanding, and that was one that Carl asked what seems like ages ago now, and I hope you're still with us, Carl. I think we've lost about 4 people, that's all, so I'm guessing you probably are still with us. So by transitioning to 50,001 with all other standards, is there still a need to complete ESOS Phase 3 and the new SECR? Right, 2 things there, and 2 things slightly differently. I saw somebody waving a hand, so that might mean that yes, you're still with us. I hope that means you're still with us. Whilst I'm answering Carl's question, if you have any other questions you want to ask, please do now. Ask those now, because we are quickly rushing towards the end. 2 things: you are going to get copies of the slides. You will get to see a recording of this as well. If you want to speak to me outside of this, my email address is richard.walsh, that's W-A-L-S-H, richard.walsh@nqa.com. I'm happy to take questions outside of this. I'm happy to provide any help that I can that doesn't take me into consultancy, because obviously we can't do that. So, thank you, Mr. Richard. Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you very much. In answer to 2 things, ESOS Phase 3, if you have 50,001 in place with a UCAS accredited certification body, or another national accreditation body, so it might, if it's America, it might be ANAB, which is the American National Accreditation Bureau, I think it stands for. If it's with a nationally accredited certification body, you can use your 50,001 certification as a tick in the box to say that you don't have to submit any ESOS applications with one critical piece of information. your 50,001 certification must cover a minimum of 90% of your total energy usage. So if you're not covering everything within your 50,001 system, if you're not covering an area that's more than 10%, then that won't be acceptable. That's because within ESOS, there's a 10% de minimis. You can exclude 10% of your energy usage in the reporting. So long as your 50,001 scope covers more than 90% of the energy usage within the business, you can just submit your 50,001 certificate. Whether it was the old standard or the new standard, that doesn't change, that doesn't make a difference. SECR is a little bit different, and 50,001 doesn't give you that get out clause for SECR. That comes under reporting requirements in terms of things like greenhouse gases. What 50,001 isn't is a greenhouse gas management system. Obviously within SECR, it is all about energy reporting, but it doesn't remove your requirement from having to carry out SECR reporting, because that sits under the sort of company's reporting requirements. So I'm afraid I can say half and half. So by transitioning, you get yourself out of ESOS phase 3, but you don't get yourself out of SECR. The other question, how to calculate EMPIs and EN? We haven't time in an audit in a thing like this to actually talk about calculating performance indicators and baseline. That would require something in itself. If you need help in calculating a baseline, in calculating performance indicators, you probably need help from somebody other than a certification body. You probably need to go to a trade association or an energy management consultant who will help you further in calculating baseline and performance indicators. Can we get the TR6 prior to notification? Yes, if you can't find it on our website, Cameron, bob me an email and I'll send you one out. We did talk about routinely sending them out with all the information from this presentation, but we decided against that. If you can't find it in our website, I think it's there, bob me an email, richard.walsh@nqa.com, and I'll send you one. It's not unique to, well, that variety of it's unique to us. All certification bodies have got something similar, but yes, send us an email and I'll send you one if need be. Any more questions that anybody might have? I'm sorry, I've gone 22 minutes over, but I think it's been useful. So I thank you for your time. Just as a reminder, send me an email if there's anything else you want to ask. You will get copies of the slides probably early next week. Log on to the NQA YouTube channel and you will find recordings of this and all our other webinars on a wide variety of subjects on quality, environment, health and safety. Some new ones on COVID-19 and how you might make your workplace safe. That's really only relevant if you're in the UK. But other than that, I thank you very much. Thank you for your time. And as I say, if you suddenly log out and think, crikey, I wished I'd asked him this, send me an email. Thanks a lot. Have a good rest of the day, wherever we are, wherever part of the world we're in. And I'm sure I'll catch up with you again at some future webinars. Thanks a lot, everybody, and see you sometime again. Cheers, then. Bye-bye.